That is all in for this evening. The Rachel Maddow Show starts right now. Good evening, Rachel.
Good evening, Chris. Thank you. At 8:30 p.m. tonight, the United States military says they started bombing inside Syria. It is awkward to say that the U.S. is bombing inside Syria instead of just saying they're bombing Syria. But that awkward phrasing is because this bombing campaign tonight is not against the Syrian government or the Syrian military. It's against a group that, in fact, is fighting the Syrian government, a group that now controls huge swaths of both Syria and Iraq. U.S. bomber and fighter jets and drones have been bombing inside Iraq since August 8th. The Iraqi government welcomed and, in fact, begged for those airstrikes to help Iraqi security forces fight against ISIS in that country. But over the border in Syria, it is a very different story. The government in Syria does not welcome and is certainly not asking for U.S. airstrikes inside their country. In fact, Syria has said it would see any airstrikes by anyone on its territory as an act of aggression. But those airstrikes have, in fact, started tonight. The U.S. military announcing tonight that these aircraft, F-22s, F-16s, F-15s, F-A-18s, and also stealth B-1 bombers, they've announced that all of these aircraft are taking part in the initial bombing attack on Syria tonight, or inside Syria tonight. I should mention that this may be the first time that F-22 Raptors are being used in this kind of a combat mission, so that may be significant just as a matter of military history and capability. But all those aircraft were reportedly used in the initial attack, which started again at 8:30 p.m. Eastern tonight, with a target list of about 20 sites, about 20 ISIS targets in and around Raqqa, which is in eastern Syria. They describe, the Pentagon describing these targets as ISIS command and control facilities, headquarters facilities, logistics sites, fuel depots, weapons depots, training sites, and troop encampments. Following those attacks from manned aircraft, the Pentagon said tonight the first wave of bombings from manned aircraft would then be followed by further bombing by drones and also by missile strikes from Tomahawk missiles fired from U.S. Navy ships nearby. So these airstrikes in Syria are not being done in conjunction with any on-the-ground troops in Syria. In Iraq, on the other hand, the U.S. military has said they're hoping that Iraqi forces would be able to capitalize on the ground following those U.S. bombs from above. It's not like that in Syria. There are no plans for that in Syria. There's no Western ground troops in Syria, certainly. There's no friendly government ground troops in Syria. There's a raging, multi-sided civil war in Syria. And so somebody will capitalize on these U.S. airstrikes against ISIS targets, but we don't know who will capitalize on them, and we actually can't control who capitalizes on them. So with that as the setting, here's a few things to consider. The first question is, will it work? Is this new air war likely to succeed at its objectives? To that end, look at this. This is from the front page of the New York Times earlier tonight. Can we drop the breaking news bug there for a second? We just drop that so we can see the screen? Thank you. The bottom story was their lead all day at the New York Times. Airstrikes fail to dislodge ISIS in Iraq. That was first. Then they had to run the new big headline. U.S. and allies strike ISIS targets in Syria. So one and then the other, right? And this is kind of a Rorschach test. One way to see this sequence is, well, it didn't work in Iraq, so why are we doing more of this thing that didn't work? The other way to see it is, yes, of course, it wouldn't work just to target ISIS in Iraq without hitting them in Syria. Without hitting them in Syria, you never get anywhere. So now that you're hitting in Syria, now they'll start to work everywhere. So what kind of person are you? Glass half full? Glass half empty? Worried about this more than you're excited about it? I mean, it's question one. Can ISIS be hurt or beaten this way? Open question. Also, question two. Who's involved in this? The initial statement from the Pentagon said the U.S. undertook military action tonight along with partner nation forces. Well, NBC News has been told tonight that the nations involved operationally in tonight's actions include Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, Jordan, and Qatar. Now, if they are, in fact, operationally involved in these airstrikes, that may be hugely important in terms of how the world sees this military action and how the world reacts to these airstrikes. And that is an acute consideration at the outset of any war. But what is particularly acute right now is because there's something like 140 world leaders, including President Obama, who are convening right now at the United Nations in New York for the General Assembly. When President Obama speaks at the United Nations over the next couple of days, he's going to be getting direct personal reaction from world leaders into what he's doing. Who is involved with the U.S. in these strikes will make a very big difference in terms of how the world reacts. So, number one, will it work? Number two, who's involved and how will the world react? Number three is how will Syria react? Because the Syrian government has a substantial air defense system, a very substantial air defense system. They have their own considerable air force as well. When Syria said they would see airstrikes by us or anybody else as an act of aggression against them as a nation, did they mean that they would shoot at our planes? Is this now a war with Syria in addition to being a war inside Syria? And beyond those questions, I've got two more. Because the U.S. telegraphed in advance that this attack would be coming, has ISIS integrated itself into civilian areas so that attacks on them will also harm Syrian civilians? How isolatable are they? And did that problem get worse over the last 2 weeks after the U.S. directly telegraphed we'd be doing this, but before we started it? And while I'm on a roll, here's one more. Not to put too fine a point on it, but is this legal? The administration says its basis for waging this new air war against ISIS is the authorization for using military force that the U.S. Congress passed in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. That authorization for the use of military force authorized force against the perpetrators of the 9/11 attacks, which were 13 years ago, long before ISIS or anything like ISIS was a twinkling in any terrorist's eye. In terms of this fight against ISIS, the U.S. Congress has not authorized anything in Syria, let alone in Iraq. Is it legal for the U.S. military to be doing this right now? Is it legal for the president to have ordered this? And is Congress really going to sit on its hands and stay on vacation for the next 2 months now that the U.S. has started a new air war in the Middle East? We're going to speak with a member of Congress about that last point in just a moment. But first, let's bring in NBC News foreign correspondent Ayman Mohyeldin. Ayman, thanks very much for staying up till the dead of night with us and being here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Rachel.
As the U.S. Targets what they say are 20 ISIS targets in and around Raqqa, is it fair to ask how much ISIS is actually headquartered in Raqqa, in this area in Syria where the U.S. is launching strikes tonight? Are they the kind of group that you could cut the head off at headquarters and it would make an important difference across the region?
Well, the short answer to that is, as you mentioned, the airstrikes in Iraq have not yet dislodged ISIS completely. Now, there's no doubt that there have been, over the course of the last several months, a solidification, if you will, of ISIS's positions inside Raqqa. That has been the operational headquarters, certainly an area that they have firmly in their control and have been able to use to coordinate attacks, to store weapons, to build up their ammunition supplies and deploy them, and in some cases even train fighters. It's also believed to be an ideological center point for the group to draw recruits and then spread those out across the regions that they are trying to fight. I think it's important that symbolically and operationally Raqqa has been struck. I think it's going to be not so clear in the coming days whether or not it's going to degrade ISIS just with at least 1 day of strikes, as we've seen tonight, Rachel.
What do we know about the level of involvement from these other Arab nations, the Saudis, the Emiratis, Bahrain, Jordan, Qatar? Do we know how much they are all involved? And is that the sort of thing that we will hear from them officially, or will this always be something covert from their perspective?
Both. I've spoken to some Arab leaders this evening, some Arab diplomats, and they have spoken to me privately saying that some will make comments following President Obama's speech. They want President Obama to come out first and set the tone for this international engagement, if you will. But more importantly, they'll come out and speak about it. Now, they may not necessarily address the operational involvement, but they'll certainly lend their diplomatic support to the United States and to the operation. There's no doubt Arab countries in the region are going going to spin this into their favor. Every country that is supporting this fight against ISIS will use this in some ways as justification for something it is doing domestically. Consider, for example, the case in Egypt, where President Sisi has been cracking down on dissent. He's also waging a war against terrorists inside the northern part of the Sinai Peninsula. So he has been saying all along that if the U.S. goes to war against ISIS inside Syria, it should not stop there, that this should also be an example for what he's trying to do in neighboring Libya and in his own territory. So I think you can see countries try to spin this politically and diplomatically for their own domestic consideration, but I think you'll also get some idea of what involvement they may be playing. Now, there's no doubt the U.S. is the lead military force on this, but there are indications that countries like Jordan are providing intelligence on the ground, that other countries like Bahrain, which is home to the naval fleet, is providing key logistical support for some of the operations, and other countries, perhaps like Egypt, providing the waterways, including the Red Sea, access to the Red Sea for U.S. naval ships to fire some of those missiles into Syria.
I mean, what should we think about, or what should we expect in terms of the Syrian government response? Obviously, ahead of this, they said, you cannot do this without us. You must work through us if you want to fight these groups. We've been fighting them all this time. The only legitimate force in Syria is the Syrian government. U.S. officials are telling reporters tonight that Syria was not given advance notice that these strikes were going to happen. We're also hearing through Pentagon correspondent Jim Miklaszewski that U.S. military officials aren't all that worried about Syrian air defenses. Not that they're not considerable, but they think that Syria essentially wouldn't dare shoot at U.S. planes who are engaged in sorties this way. What do you think we should expect from the Syrian government in response here?
That is certainly going to depend on what happens in terms of the U.S.'s intensification of strikes on the ISIS targets in the next coming days. If the United States really degrades ISIS over the course of days or weeks and really allows for Syrian rebels to regroup, to once again have a front line against the Assad regime, you can bet that the Syrian regime is going to fight back ferociously and try to suppress that. Now, right now, they're certainly not going to object to U.S. airstrikes against ISIS. The Syria conflict is a very complex one. Right now, U.S. and Syrian interests have aligned, albeit very briefly, in this fight against ISIS. There's no doubt that if the Syrian government, though, feels that it is once again being threatened by these airstrikes, I suspect that the United States will have a hard time, perhaps not necessarily militarily, with trying to penetrate Syrian air defenses, but you'll see the Syrian government find other ways to lash out against perhaps U.S. interests in the region. Again, not necessarily militarily, but diplomatically and in other ways against Syrian rebels that the U.S. is trying to prop up inside that country to hold the territory that it wins over for by degrading ISIS.
Watching to see ground forces of any stripe try to capitalize on U.S. air power is going to be both chaotic and fascinating in terms of seeing the power balance in the region. NBC News foreign correspondent Ayman Mohyeldin. It is after 5 in the morning, London, where you are right now. I really appreciate you doing this for us, Ayman. Thank you.
My pleasure. My pleasure.